Today was yet another endgame test for Alireza Firouzja, so he's been struggling a bit this tournament. He doesn't look as sharp as he did at the end of last year. He's had 5.5 months off, and the other day he failed to convert an endgame against LEvon Aronian. He had about a -8 advantage with black, should have won the game, didn't, it ended a draw, so he's a bit shaken. His endgames look tetchy. What would happen today against Shak Mamedyarov? Could he hold this one? Well, let's see what happened here. So Shak kicked off with pawn d4. Alireza went knight f6. We had c4 and pawn e6. And what we'll see after knight c3 is that Alireza goes bishop to b4. So he plays a mainline Nimzo Indian. He likes to do this one. The whole idea here for black is that you're fighting for control of that e4 square. So queen c2 was played, the classical variation, and now many moves for black. You can go d5 here, you can go castles. Alireza went for c5, another very main move. Shak captured that one, and again there's a couple of main moves here. The bishop could recapture, knight a6. Alireza goes castles instead. Now the knight came to f3, and now knight a6 was played, preparing to recapture that pawn with the knight. And g3 now was selected by Shak, so he wants to fianchetto the bishop. The knight took on c5, and once again we can see the theme of the black play, pressuring on that e4 square, and after bishop to g2, a knight landed on that square, pressuring this knight here. So white just castled. This has all been seen many times before, but here Alireza really goes his own way. Once again, a very fighting option. So he takes on c3 here, but he doesn't take with the knight. This is the main way to play. We've seen countless games from this position. You shatter the pawns, but you keep the bishop pair, that one retreats. But what Alireza did here was take with the bishop. So now you do shatter the pawns, but you've given up your bishop pair. This is a bit more risky, and there's only one 2700 game in the database that I could see here, the LeChess database, and that was actually between Shak Mamedyarov with white and Veselin Topalov back in 2013. So Shak's seen this before, but a long time ago. Now in that game, pawn d5 was immediately played. Here Alireza went queen to c7, he pressures c4, but Shak ignores it with the move knight to d4. He pressures on that e4 knight in the centre of the board. It has to be defended. White captures, the pawn recaptures, and now black's got the isolated queen's pawn, yes, but white's got this horrible backwards c3 pawn. So Shak now goes bishop to f4, attacking the queen, and it sets a trap for white actually, black rather. If you take this pawn here with the queen, well, the problem is the queen can recapture, knight takes, and then this rook hits the c-file. And basically all the white pieces are now invading before you're actually developed here on the back rank. So where does this knight actually go? If it comes back here, well then f3 is really strong. That knight's running out of squares basically. You'd have to do something ugly like g5. It's just a terrible position. If you come to a4, well then again we're going to be invading soon. There's bishop d6 coming. It's just no good. So you can't take that c3 pawn. You're not yet properly developed. So Alireza instead goes queen to c5. He just maintains that pressure. Now this rook came to c1, preparing pawn c4, and Alireza simply develops bishop d7, connects his rooks. So Shak goes knight b3, hits the queen. It dropped back to e7 here, looking down that e-file, and now pawn c4 from Shak. He manages to liberate, but he has to be aware of the tactics here, because after rook to c8, which Alireza played, we can see that pawn's now pinned. But Shak's response was the excellent queen to d3, and here you have to really know what's going on tactically, because after pawn takes, rook takes is forced, but then what are you doing after bishop b5? Now this wasn't played because there's a tactical trick here. Can you see the move? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button to let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already to never miss a future video. So the move here is rook takes on e4, and now you don't have time to take the queen, or you lose your own queen, and now you're actually just a piece down. And if instead you take this rook here with the knight, well then the problem is we take on b5. We've picked up 2 minor pieces for the rook. This is much better for white. So that move's no good of going bishop to b5. So Alireza just chopped here, the queen recaptured, he brought his rook to the c file, and now the queen dropped back to d3 here, and again a good positional learning moment. Something like bishop c6 might look quite natural here, but then actually you're just running into knight d4 at a later moment. You've now blocked the c file for your rook, so white can go rook to c1. So bishop c6 just isn't the best move. It blocks out the rook, not the right square. So knight c3 was played, a much more active move. Now that one's looking at the 2 pawns. So we had knight d4 protecting e2, and now taking here is not very good. White can pick up here on b7. This is just better. Plus you've kind of sidelined your knight. Again, just not ideal, not the most active way to play. So instead Alireza went queen to b4, looking to invade on b2 potentially one day. And there's also a tactical shot here. So say you did something random like pawn h3 for example. Well, now black can take on d4, because after the queen recaptures, then you've got this one, forking queen and king, you're a piece ahead. So Shak had to respond to that threat. He went bishop to f3, covering e2, but now this bishop came to h3, it hits the rook, and the rook doesn't actually have a ton of squares. So if you come to e1, for example, you're running into some discovered attacks from the queen, and if you come to c1, well again there's some similar problems. There's actually now this shot of knight takes on e2. Now the best move is recaptures with the queen, but then you can take here with check, bishop recaptures, and you pick up the knight on d4. Now white can pick up this pawn here, restore the material balance, but it's a good way for black to equalise. Shak didn't want to go down this line, so instead of going for this one with moving the rook to c1, that's why he instead brought it all the way over to the a file here. And now h6 was played by Alireza, classic grandmaster move, give your king a bit of luft. And now knight f5 from Shak, a very active attacking move, looking to come into that d6 square. And actually the best way to defend against that threat was bring this knight into e4 here, cover the square. But what Alireza did was take this knight with the bishop. Now when you do this, of course, you're now giving white the bishop pair for a long period of the game, so this could be dangerous for black if Alireza's not careful. Now his rook is hit, it came to the e-file here, pressuring that e-pawn, and the best move for Shak here was actually queen d3, centralising that queen, holding the pawn, and now if black goes for queen b2, takes on a2, well you're still pressuring the knight, so this whole plan isn't as good. But what Shak did here was he went bishop to e3 instead, not quite as precise. Alireza goes queen b2, now rook e1, and he can pick up here. There's no pressure on the knight, so black is a pawn ahead, but it's temporary because we can see these ones are being lasered by the bishops. So the queen came to c5 now, it hit knight, it also hit the pawn, so the knight jumped into e4, protected its brother, and now Shak picked up here. So the queens are coming off in this variation. The bishop recaptured. Now pawn b5 from Alireza. He gets that one going. The bishop recentralized. Rook to d8 attacked it. And pawn e3 defended. But now Alireza gets pawn b4. Now you can't actually go rook b1 here. We can see this knight's doing a really nice job of controlling that square. So rook c1 was played instead, preventing b3 because of the pressure on the knight here. And so Alireza hopped this knight into d2, and he's actually forcing this towards an endgame now with less pieces on the board. So the bishop on f3 is attacked, you're about to take with check, plus there's a threat to go knight b3 here, forking both of these pieces. So you have to give up one of your bishops here. Bishop d1 was an option, but what Shak did was take on c3, and now Alireza actually had an opportunity to just steer this towards an easy draw. So he could have taken here with check. After king g2, then you can take on h2 here, picking up a pawn, and whether white takes here or instead takes here, this is just liquidating. You've got a 3-on-3 on the king side, should be an easy draw. But what Alireza did instead, and maybe he had more ambitions, was take here with the pawn, leave that pawn on c3, and now the bishop escapes to g4. So we've got a bit of a different situation here, because whilst this pawn might look aggressive, actually it could become weak later on, and we see that in the game. So we had knight coming into e4 now. It holds this pawn, and you can't actually start kicking it with pawn f3, or then it simply drops back to f6. Yes, you could pick up here, but then black picks up here. The pawn structure is shattered, should be a comfortable draw for black. So that's why we didn't have pawn f3. Instead, the knight was attacked like this. So it dropped back into d6 here, the bishop came to h3, and we just had a bit of tickle going on now, and now the bishop lands on d3. And it looks beautiful on that square, dominating all the forward jumps of the knight. So the rook came to c8 defending the pawn. Now the king marched in, and Alireza went pawn f4 here, f5 rather. So he's securing that e4 square for his knight at a later point. But that is a slightly weakening pawn move if we ever have the 3-on-4 on the king side, and that's something we'll see later on in the game. So now the king came to e2, king f7, king d1, and now king f6 from Alireza. He spent 22 minutes over this move, so he's not entirely comfortable in this endgame. You know, he's not as sharp as he was. So he's trying to feel his way through here. Rook to a1 now played. And there were a couple of ways here to try and steer this towards equality. So you could go rook b8 coming down to b2. Alireza went for this one, knight e4. Also a good move. You attack this pawn here, and if the bishop captures, pawn recaptures, king c2, well actually this should be quite comfortable for black after say king to g5. You're marching in here, say h3 to stop that, well then rook f8 comes. You're hitting f2, it's quite hard to defend. If you go rook f1, well then we come back with the rook to hold the pawn. Should be a draw here. So the bishop didn't capture on e4, f3 was played instead. Now Alireza jumped in, gave this check, and he played this move with just 40 seconds on his clock. So that's how low on time he's getting. He plays the rest of the game on increment now, and this is a 96 move game. This is just move 44. So he's under pressure here, but he does get 30 seconds a move. So after the king moved here, he chopped on d3, the king recaptured, and now king e5 was played, bringing that king in. Now you could go rook c1 here, but Shak seemed to want to avoid rook d8 check, so he went king c2 first. We had rook c7, Alireza waits, rook a3, rook b7. The rook picked up here, and again Alireza waits. He covers his 7th rank, but Shak invades like this. And now we can see one of the pieces around the weakening of that pawn on f5. If you imagine a structure here with pawn on f7, pawn on g6, h5, you know, it'd be much more comfortable for black to play, but this is a bit trickier. So now Alireza goes active, he checks with the rook, and Shak now starts running towards the king side. Otherwise these checks will be endless, or he'll have to give up on e3. So we had check here, king f1, and now Alireza takes on h2, but Shak gets rook g6, he's picking up on g7, so h5 from Alireza. One day he might go pawn h4 here. We had takes on g7, and now a nice move from Alireza. He goes king f6, chasing that rook around. It came to g8, king f7. Now it swings behind the pawn, king g7, and now king g1, hit the black rook, and Alireza understands he can't trade rooks here. That's a lost king and pawn endgame. So it comes behind this e-pawn. He's happy to give h4 e-pawn here. That should be a draw. The rook came to e8, therefore it defended this pawn. The king attacked. It came to e5. The king attacked again. And if you keep coming back, you go to e8, well, king f7, it'll be a draw. So pawn f4 was forced to keep making progress, and now king g6. And the key thing here is that black just needs to keep this white king shut off, and then it should be a draw. But there's work to be done yet, because at some point white will get e4, then start pushing f5, could get dangerous. So rook e8 played, king g7. We had a few shuffly moves here. I'm just going to whiz through these ones. My computer's lagging. I think this endgame's just killed it. King g7, now pawn e4 was played by Shak. So we had a pawn captures there, the rook recaptured, king f6, rook e5, hits the pawn, defended with king g6, a check from here, king h6, Now king f1 and rook b2, and this is why it's a problem. You just can't make progress here. So the rook now has to come back. You have to bring it round to help the king get active. So king g6, rook e2, Alireza avoids the exchange. Rook to h2 here, hit the pawn. And what Shak's actually doing now is building a bridge for his king. So we'll see the importance of that in a moment. Rook b3 hit the pawn, king g2 defended, rook b2 check, king h3. And now this is where you have to be careful. So rook b1 was played, this rook came to a2, we had rook h1 check, the king came back to g2 here, now rook b1, rook a6 check, king g7 and rook a3. And this is where I want to pause because you have to be very careful as black, because what you want to avoid here is the king actually running up to h4 and then into g5. Then things could get really scary. So if you check from b2, that's a mistake, because now king h3 is played and you can't check on the h-file. You can't play this move, of course, you lose your rook. So say you go rook b1, well now white invades. You give the check, king g5. This is a problem. Now white's getting very active. So you can't keep checking from that second rank. You have to shuffle along the first rank. Alireza understands this, so he just nudges with the king. We had king f3, rook f1 check, king g2, rook b1, rook a6 check, king g7, and now rook e6, and again Alireza waits. He doesn't go rook b2 check. That would be a mistake. He goes rook a1, waits on that first rank. Now we had king to f2, rook b1, and at some point Shak has to push the f-pawn if he wants to make progress. So rook e1, rook b2 check, king f3, king f6. This rook came to e5, few more shuffly moves here, and now the pawn kicks on to f5. But still this should be a draw. As long as you can keep checking from the side here, the king does a good job blockading this one. Should be a draw, but time is low for Alireza. Rook b4, rook e4 offers an exchange, rook b6 avoided it, rook h4 attacks the pawn, that was defended, king f4, rook b4 check, and now the king came up here, more checks, and actually Shak realises here he couldn't make progress, the game was a draw. Anytime you start pushing that pawn, it's just going to drop off the board, the king is too well placed, so's the rook, checking from the side. Good hold by Alireza, but a very tough fight today. Shak really took him to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see my playlist of all the games that Alireza's played in this tournament, then click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.